The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your guest host for the sick Chris McDaniel, Jason Rosenbaum of the St. Louis Beacon. Joining me in studio today is
Rachel Lippman, pinch hitting for Chris McDaniel, St. Louis Public Radio.
And
Joe Manis of the St. Louis Beacon.
And our very special guest today,
Lewis Reed, president of the Board of Aldermen.
Now, I must say for our listeners, you are the second president to be on our show. We had President Pro Tem Tom Dempsey, but you're
of the State Senate.
Of the State Senate. But we're always glad to have presidential talent on the show.
I wouldn't put a lot of stake in that, President.
But that was going to be my first question to you. I want you to just tell our listeners kind of what the Board of Aldermen president does, what their responsibilities are, and kind of their function within St. Louis city government.
Well, Jason, as the president of the Board of Aldermen, you are the head of the legislative branch of city government. You preside over all of the Board of Aldermen meetings, and they meet every Friday at 10 o'clock. You also sit on the Board of E&A, so in this case, you get an opportunity to really weigh in on the executive branch also through the Board of E&A. You sit on the East-West Gateway Coordinating Council. You sit on the Airport Commission and a number of things like that. You appoint all members of the Board of Aldermen to the committees, and by the nature of being the president of the Board of Aldermen, you also have a seat on every committee, so you can vote on every committee if you'd like. You also, you can introduce bills and so on and so forth. So, in a nutshell, that kind of gives you.
And we appreciate your succinct explanation of the office because I think it's important for our listeners to know. But I wanted to just our listeners also to know a little bit more about yourself. And now you do have a deep, dark secret. You are from Illinois, sort of like me.
Yeah, that's it. Went to Joliet Central. so high school you go to in St. Louis.
I went to Stevenson High School, which is a suburban hoity-toity school.
So how'd you end up in St. Louis?
Well, I ended up in St. Louis. I was a wrestler in high school and everything, and I had a wrestling scholarship to SIUE. And at the time, Larry Christoph was one of the coaches on the Olympic team. So I had a choice to come here, to go to Notre Dame, and a few other schools.
So it was either here or the Olympics.
University of Minnesota. So I said I came to St. Louis, and I've enjoyed it and been here ever since. And then started a small, construction business development company. Worked for McBride & Son for a number of years and on development issues around the city, things of that nature. And then got an opportunity to go into my profession when I went to work for SSM Health Businesses. And I managed their wide area and local area network groups at all their hospitals across the U.S. And really enjoyed that job.
Now, so when did you first get elected? Because you were first an alderman.
Yes, I was an alderman of the 6th Ward. I was elected in 1999. It seems like a long time ago now, but...
I was 13 years old.
13 years old. Yeah.
I was, can't figure out the math, immediately 16.
Let's not embarrass
Let's not go
there. Yeah, you're making me feel old. But, And
you feel old.
Yeah.
Experience.
Yeah. And the thing I think that drew me to elected office was, when I in my previous life working to try to help, put together development deals and get things moving through the city, it was very difficult from a business perspective, right? So, the office came open in the 6th Ward, and, I said, hey, my wife actually pushed me to the front and said, why don't you run? I said, no, I don't think so. Eventually, I said, all right, I'll do it. And I ran because I wanted to get in and try to help get some of these things done. Never in my wildest dreams, I think, 13, 14 years later, that would be, what I've committed full time to doing.
Now,
It's a
when
lot
did
of
you
work to
first
do.
become president of the Board of Aldermen?
Became president of the Board of Aldermen, I guess, 8 years ago. So,
Yes, you were elected.
2007, you
right,
defeated
2007.
16th Ward resident Jim Shrewsbury.
Shrewsbury.
I always got to give a shout out to the 16th
Well,
Ward.
well, he wasn't. I mean, he was more than a resident. at the
Obviously,
time.
he was
Yeah.
a citywide official, but that was a. I mean, I noted this in my profile of you earlier. That was a race that a lot of people didn't think that you were going to win. You were kind of running from behind, didn't have as many endorsements. What do you think put you over the top in that contest?
I think we had a very focused and targeted campaign. We were able to, sometimes the bigger the campaigns get, the more difficult it gets to, stay on message and really, have an opportunity to connect with the voters and really truly get them to understand what you're about and what you're trying to deliver and what it is. In this last election, I don't think we were able to do that.
Yeah, for mayor. Yeah, well, you kind of segued perfectly into that because I covered the mayor's race.
We all
last
did.
spring.
We all
Yeah,
did.
We all
Yeah.
did. We all did.
Yeah.
So you want to talk a little bit about what you learned? I mean, we don't want to replay the race, but talk about what you learned from that, especially now that you're going to be running for re-election as Aldermanic president in a couple years.
Yeah, and thanks for saying, we don't want to relive it. I certainly, for one.
Well, people can
It
read
was-
my.
it was,
People can read all of our stories or listen to them.
Yeah.
They don't have to go.
Yeah,
go there.
the thing I think I learned from that race, amongst a lot of things, was it was very, very difficult to get my real true message out, who I am, what I stand for, and what my beliefs are, right? And like I said, running for president, we were able to do that. Running for mayor, it was a lot more difficult to do that because we were operating from such a huge deficit. Our opponent had $3.7 million. We ended up putting together $700,000. And it made it very difficult to get our message out. I think that was the first thing. Organization is absolutely everything going into it. And the thing that I think I always take away from those things, and when and I don't know how other elected officials feel about it, but for me, when you go through those campaigns and stuff, I always feel so bad, because you feel like you've let so many people down. Because you go through the city and stuff and you meet people, they talk to you about the things that are important to them, and you hope to be able to have an opportunity to change their lives in a significant manner. And that's the one thing that's for me is really hard to get over, which is why when I became president of the Board of Aldermen, when you're either the mayor, the comptroller, or president of the Board of Aldermen, you automatically get a car.
Right, because you're on the board of estimate and apportionment for the listeners, just so they know.
Yeah, you get a car and you get a gas card, right? So I won, became president of the Board of Aldermen, come to my office like a week into my office. Secretary had a credit card and set of keys that the supply commissioner said, "This is your car, it's parked in whatever spot." Went out there, took a look at, for the listeners and everybody, I ride a bike because, it's the healthy part of it and, the also carbon emissions and stuff. So I get in the car, drive it for, a couple weeks, home, back, and stuff. Then this big article comes out that, President of the Board of Aldermen has a car with a luxury package on it, right? And I remember looking at those headlines and thinking, my God, can you imagine, being a voter on the other side or somebody that has, put everything on the line and talked to their neighbors and everything and said, I want to go out and you should support this person. And then 2 to 3 weeks into that, they read headlines that now you're rolling around in a car with heated steering wheel. And it just, for me, it just hurt me so deeply because I said, I don't want them to feel like, that's what I've done. So, I turned around and gave the car back and gave the keys, credit card, and everything back. They said, "Sure, you don't want it?" No, I don't want it. But there wasn't anything special about that car. I mean, it was the standard car that the city has, but I just happened to be my turn in the barrel. So some of those things when you're in politics are things that I guess for me are life changing. You begin to look at it different.
How do you think the experience of running against the mayor that you now have to work with as president of the Board of Aldermen, does that change how the board functions or how you approach your role now as president of the board?
For me, it doesn't. I'm sure for him, it probably does, because the way I look at it is there were a number of things that I would have done differently in the race, but in that role, and there's a number of things I would do differently today also in that role, but what's important, I think, for all of us, if you're going to be an elected official, when you go to the table, you cannot look at it just as me against him or me, because you will never get anywhere. We'll be just like Congress, absolutely deadlocked. But if it's an issue and it's something that's good for the city, it's good for the constituency, we should support it and we should move it. It should not matter who's on the other side of the table, right? Mm-hmm. But if it's something that's bad for the city and bad for the constituency, I think you have an obligation to speak up and say, no, this isn't good. Now, the first point I raised was one that was used against me in the race for mayor, because Francis Slay said everywhere he went, he said he supported most of the things that I've done, right? And when you look at that on its face, it's a good political issue. It makes for a good sound bite, and it's crisp and it's clean, and people get it. But that's what you should do. If it's something that's important, if something that's good, if something that's good for the residents and the people, you should support it, no matter who's carrying it. It shouldn't be about the person that's carrying it.
Did you sense the dynamics in the board change at all, and different
absolutely.
factions and stuff start to kind of, does that affect the way that the city's now being governed legislatively?
I think, like, for example, I think that there are, a handful of people, not a lot of people on the board, but there are, and Rachel and you guys all know it because you're down there.
Right. And just for
4 or 5.
Yeah, just for our listeners, it's an all Democratic board except for Scott Ogilvie. But it is factionalized. There are people who, for example, are closer to you. There are people who are closer to the mayor. And while a lot of it gets kind of simplified as white-black or something, it's not nearly like that, because
exactly.
there are African-American aldermen who are closer to the mayor. There are white aldermen who are closer to you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thanks for raising that, Jason, too. But, yes, the dynamics of the board have indeed changed, because now you have 2 or 3 people that feel that is absolutely in their best interest to proceed kind of like the House and the Senate, the U.S. House, when you have the Democrats and Republicans, that they need to oppose anything that I do, no matter what it is, right? But again, it's not the board at large. It's 3 or 4 members that will spend every waking hour to make sure that they oppose those things, because that's the politics that they're engaged in now. And the challenge for me on my side is to recognize that, but don't get tempted and go down that rabbit hole and get goaded into these senseless fights, because then we're just absolutely stagnated. So what that ends up looking like is, somebody may sucker punch me. All right, you sucker punch me. Then the next day is something that's good that we need to get past, and they're the person that's carrying it. So I have 2 choices. I can sucker punch them back, or I can say, well, you know what, this thing is good for the city, it's good for the residents, let's get it passed, I'm going to help you get it passed. So that's been the dynamic, in politics, a lot of people would look at that and say, you don't want to proceed that way because it makes you look weak, because, people, when they're looking at strength and power, they say, well, it's better that you look strong, and if somebody sucker punches you, you have to trot them out in the middle of town square and stone them. And
let's not do that.
That's probably not the.
Let's even have a town square anymore here.
Yeah, we don't have a
Something
town
more
square.
sublime.
Yeah, let's go to kind of some more specifics, because one of the things that has been in the news is kind of a power struggle of sorts on the ENA about contracts, which is kind of in this larger context of whether the mayor should have more or less power. Nick Pister of the Post-Dispatch wrote an article about this, and Joe has been following this issue for years.
Close to 40 years.
So I'll hand it off to Joe.
Okay, I just want to say one thing, because I covered City Hall from 1978 to 81, which is when most of our listeners and most of the people in the room were not alive.
Yeah, there we go. And then the obligation.
Okay, but
I wish I could say that.
I was a young reporter then. I was young. But my point is that ENA, all the way back then, was always combative. And without boring people with too many stories, I covered ENA when the mayor was Jim Conway, the Board of Aldermen president was Paul Simon, and the comptroller was Ray Persich. And you could hear them shouting at each other from you could be outside the mayor's office in that hallway there, through the two sets of double doors and that big lobby. You could hear them shouting.
So I don't even know if there's shouting matches that go on in ENA now.
And there was always maneuverings. And one little quick thing is that Ray Persich had gallbladder. I'll never forget this. He had gallbladder surgery, but he kept it as secret from the mayor because he didn't want them to know, because he was afraid they would call an ENA meeting while he was in the hospital.
And there's only 3 members of the committee, so 2 is still a majority.
Because they did call a meeting. And Persich, I had seen Persich the day before the surgery because he had told me that he was, but I had to he was just telling me as a reporter so that I knew in case there was an ENA meeting called, he was going to get there. Well, there was an EMA meeting called, and there was a big deal where Persich is, at least he wasn't in his hospital gown, but he's like barely walking all the way down the hall from the comptroller's office to the mayor's office to make the ENA meeting. All the TV cameras are there. It's like this huge deal. I don't remember what the topic was, but he wanted to make sure he was there for a vote. My point being
there is a point here.
is that there was always fights like this. When Vince Shamel was mayor, when Vervis Jones was comptroller, the fights were legendary. My point being that this has been going on for a long time.
So my question for you is, because this has kind of been burst open because of this Veolia contract situation.
Yes.
And it seemed like, you were opposed to that that particular contract. The comptroller had concerns, 2-1 against the mayor. That was pretty much the issue on that point. But now it appears he wants to kind of make contracting out of that process and maybe make the office stronger or something
At least for that particular contract, that was the move he tried to make. Yes. So is this something that's going to happen more broadly, or is this just the one time they really wanted this Veolia contract?
I think that, he has been very clear about the fact that this is going to be the new norm for him. He's going to go around ENA. He is not going to bring contracts to the Board of ENA. And I think that that's problematic on a number of different levels. When you look at what happened in the Veolia water deal, and that's the one we need to look at because that's the only example that we have today. In that Veolia water deal, I couldn't find anybody in the city that says, yes, I'm okay with paying 4 times the cost for water. I'm okay with Veolia, and I just didn't find that. But it was, for whatever reason, it was a push from the administration to get this thing done, right? When they could not get it done through the Board of ENA, and what the Board of ENA did allow to happen was for citizen input, because if the Board of ENA wasn't there, that thing would have come through. It would have been signed. You wouldn't know, nobody in the city would know, right? Mm-hmm. And then what we'd find out, years down the line when we started getting, higher, bills in the mail and stuff, we would have to backtrack and find out what happened. So that allowed for the citizen input. It allowed us to engage. It allowed the media and people to know what was going on. But the workaround was for them to take what the judge called a bald, B-A-L-D, bald appropriation lacking specificity, right? And when they took a bald appropriation that came through the water department and said buried within that appropriation was the contract amount for Veolia water,
right.
I think that they stepped way over the line.
Yeah. So what do you think will happen now? Do you think that this E&A process is going to be weakened to some extent, or do you think it's going to fall into the trap where they try to weaken it, but it doesn't really amount to very much?
I think that they're going to try to weaken it. We're going to land in court. The mayor's feeling very, very powerful right now. He's feeling like I'm raising $150,000 a quarter.
He is the longest-serving mayor in St. Louis.
Longest-serving mayor in the history of the city, and all these things. So he's saying, the things that other people would have to work around, or laws and stuff like that. That stuff is not on my spectrum. I'm going to change it, and I'm going to work through whatever I have to do to change everything. I don't think anything will stop them except for when we land in court challenging it.
So I wanted to talk about a tangible power shift, because Nick's article was very interesting and good, but it didn't really touch on one thing where it was an actual example of the mayor having more power, and that's federal community development block grants.
Yes.
Now, I'm not going to bore listeners with the details. If you want to read it, go on stlbeacon.org, go on stlpublicradio.org.
And I've got to tip my hat to Jason. He was the one that laid it out to be able to put it on our website.
It's a complicated situation, but the long and short of it is HUD basically came in. They said the way that these federal block grants were being distributed had to change, and it changed basically from going by ward to this situation where CDA, I guess it's Community Development Agency,
yes,
which is under the guise of the mayor, is essentially controlling the process and whatnot. And I talked with you kind of off the cuff about it. You had some concerns about the way it was going on, and a lot of aldermen from all different factions and ages and whatever had concerns over it. What was kind of your takeaway from that process?
My takeaway was this. I think we can find some efficiencies in the process. I think that, number one, we need to make sure we engage the residents in the discussions of this. I mean, we have not. That just never happened in this first part of the process. I think we need to make sure that we factor in the concerns of some of these residents and some of the older people, and it would be nice to have had some transitional period. And I tell you why. Because when I was the alderman of the 6th Ward, we came together as a community. We passed a development plan and all this other stuff. And then it took us several years getting $50,000 a year, $100,000, $80,000, to hobble together the money we needed to do that project over a number of years. And, a lot of those projects that all across the city that were important to the residents within that community that would strengthen their neighborhoods and community, those things were just kind of tossed aside. And I think that you saw some of that frustration play out, on the floor and in committee.
Well, this is another case where this has been going back decades. And in fact, in the late 70s, when the city used to get 3 times the amount of block grant money that it gets now, roughly $40 million, and that's in late 1970 dollars, which is probably about $60 million now.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a big fight over whether or not the CDA mayor's office controlled all of it, or if the Board of Aldermen should allocate it by wards. And this fight was replayed a number of times, where some years it would be divided up, at least part of it, by wards, and then they would save some for CDA to have oversight. So what's happening now is really something similar, but in reverse to what had happened in the late 70s and early 80s, when they switched it from CDA having total control to the money starting, at least a good portion of it, being allocated ward by ward.
Nothing is ever dead in politics.
But
that's
but
right.
One of the things here's an example. Here's when I say there's room for improvement in every corner of the thing, whether it's on the ward level, whether it's in administration and anything.
Because I just want to point this out. The reason why HUD forced this change is they said that there were numerous problems with doing it by the ward level in inefficiencies and not spending money or whatnot. So I want to get their perspective out there. But continue.
Yeah. And what they pointed to, they said, okay, we look at the investment over time. How much have we invested, HUD, the federal government? How much have we put out there? And what has been our return on it, right? So that's what HUD looked at to say, okay, this is either working or not working. Then HUD gave the city, they gave us an opportunity to just go in and sculpt a program that we felt would work, right? But part of the challenge in the in the operations of the old program, it was this. There were never any any guidelines or whatever put in place that would prevent things from happening that shouldn't happen. Here's an example: the lobbyist for the Board of Aldermen, the mayor's lobbyist, right, was the person that they put over the distribution of block grant funds. So if they needed a bill passed, that lobbyist would come to an alderperson and say, "Hey, I need your vote on X, Y, or Z. By the way, next week, what time do you want to meet to talk about block grant funding?" They shift. So when you begin to look at that dynamic, is that a good thing?
Was it a quid pro quo, or was this implied quid pro quo?
I'm just going to leave that as it is. But see, when we look at structuring a program, we need to structure a program that works so that no matter who's in office, no matter who's engaged in it, that there are checks and balances and the thing just works, right? And I don't think that we're there yet because those types of things can still happen, right? And at the end of the day, it's the taxpayers that pay the ultimate price for that. Mm-hmm. And then there's always been a problem with spending the money. So you'd see it on paper, and it would be very difficult to get down to the point where you can actually make a transaction and spend that money and get that money applied to a project. So those are some of the things in the old program.
Do you think it'll be better next year when people have been able to acclimate themselves more?
Yes. I think we're heading to a better ground eventually.
On kind of the macro level, we're hearing Joe say all these stories about there being always this constant tension, and it's gone back probably even before she started covering. Right. I mean, fundamentally, is that ever going to change, or is this just kind of one more round of this kind of ongoing tension that you're going to have? Is there anything different about this particular round, if you will?
Is that for me?
Yeah, go ahead. That's for you.
I think that, and I talk to people about the legislative process and things all the time. I think that all that stuff is healthy. I don't think that there's anything wrong with disagreement. I don't think that there's anything wrong with a very tough debate. You tell me where you stand, I'll tell you where I stand, and then let's figure out how we can get to a ground that works for everybody. Because if we begin to back away from that, if we begin to say, well, I just want to get along, so whatever you say we do, then there's somebody that's left out of the picture, right? I think it's important to just put it all out there. And, you can hear from some of Joe's stories that these things are circular.
And it's on a continuum, for sure.
I don't see but as long as we, at the end of the day, the process isn't broken so much so that we cannot get to a decision point.
Well, I would argue that probably this vigorous debate, a.k.a. discussion, fights, whatever, is probably endemic to the St. Louis makeup, because when you have basically the city is governed by this 3-person board on the St. Louis the Board of Estimate and Apportionment, who governs all the fiscal stuff. So anything major has to go through E&A. When you have a 3-person triumvirate, it's like Rome, thousands of years ago. Well, I wasn't around then, but my point being that...
No, she was not around in Rome, guys.
But my point being is that you're going to have that. The only way you get around it is if you have one strong leader, and there are many who would say, well, is that better? Or worse?
Look at St. Louis County. That's an example where you have a strong executive who has absolute authority over the budget and pretty much controls everything, and not everybody's happy with the way that's going.
Right. So the point being that there's good and bad about both processes.
So we have about 10, 15 minutes left. I wanted to get into a hot topic that's been in the news. City-county merger. I guess it's been in the news for 120, 130 years now. But it kind of came to the forefront this week after this Better Together group kind of came forward as a means to study and talk about the possibility of reentry or merger. Now, when I was talking with you earlier in February, you were pretty explicit that if we were going to talk about any situation, there had to be public input, public outreach, research. Is this, in your opinion, adequate? What is going on with Better Together?
I think it's too early to tell. I think it is a good first step to begin to engage the public in a discussion, right? Because we absolutely have to involve the stakeholders in something as big as a city-county merger. But the other thing that I continue to say is I think we need to look at if we really truly want to get this thing done, we have to do it in bite-sized chunks. We have to look at whatever that low-hanging fruit is, if it's, the police department or whatever it is, and begin to work out some structural things and some intra or city-county agreements, so that we can then measure and then show some successes through those things. If we're not measuring, if we can't take it back and show the residents and people of the city of St. Louis, look what has come out of this, then I think it's going to be lost. But that's how we soften the beachhead. That's how we begin to get people on board. I think if we just go full bore, I think there's going to be a problem long term.
Now, this is kind of an out there question, but it does involve the city-county merger situation. I asked the mayor this question. I'll ask you. Do you think that the discussion of this will or should include the future of the earnings tax? I mean, part of it's political because obviously there are people within this organization close to Rex Singfeld and there's suspicion there. But there's a practical question, too. If the city and the county become one, it seems like the county property taxes could pay for some of the things that the earnings tax pay for. Theoretically, not everything. Now, do you think that should be part of the discussion as well?
It absolutely has to be part of the discussion. Think about this. St. Louis County has a tax that helps to fund their health department, right? It's specific targeted. We don't have that. So all of those things have to be put on the table, especially the earnings tax, because I think the earnings tax certainly would be in jeopardy with us.
Do you think would that be a good thing or a bad thing in your opinion?
Oh, it'd be a good thing to have those discussions. It'll be a good thing that information is put out there so that the people understand and they can key in and say, okay, all of this stuff can be impacted down the road. And what we see happening now is that that's not part of the discussion at all. So it'd be good if we can begin to let people know that is part of it. Can I make sure that one other thing I want to put out there? Sure. One of the things that troubles me about the city-county merger, and I'm going out on a limb. I'm sure I'm going to get attacked by all three of you when I say this one. But this idea that we do a city-county merger, and now all of a sudden we can water down our crime statistics. Look how great we're doing. Now we don't look so bad. It's kind of like having a terminal illness and instead of or not a terminal illness but having the flu and buying and you're having a choice between getting a new pair of shoes or buying the medicine to make sure that you medicate.
Well, that's there's been a wide criticism of that for that very reason, i.e. merging the crime statistics, because even though it might change the math, it doesn't change the reality.
Yeah, exactly right.
However, on the other hand, and I'm not arguing for or against that, but when you're comparing with other cities, I mean, St. Louis and Baltimore are the only two that have this situation where the city's not part of the county, so it's actually skewed statistics when you're comparing them to other cities. I mean, Indianapolis, for example, their city and county are one and the same, and part of suburban Indianapolis used to be, and I think still is, farmland. So their statistics are going to be different than ours. I mean, so one could say that well, whatever you need to do, it needs to be comparing apples to apples.
Yeah, and when we do that, if you take a look at cities that are similar size as us, right, and I've done this, a couple of years ago, when you look at those cities and you look at on a per capita basis, and you take a look at and you'll find out how out of whack our numbers are, and our numbers are out of whack when we compare to very similar cities with very similar makeup, and not some of the ones that obviously wouldn't be good comparisons. But the thing that I want to make sure that we get out there is although it can change our numbers, at the end of the day, it won't change some of the underlying things. If you take a look at on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, just the per capita numbers within neighborhoods across the city of St. Louis, some of our neighborhoods, right, have more crime within that neighborhood than like the entire city of East St. Louis and you know, in other areas across the United States. So we need to go in and find out what's structurally happening there. We know that jobs make a difference. We know the economic situation makes a difference within those communities, resources, and it's really important that we begin to align these nonprofits and these resources that are available within our community and target some of these areas as hard as we can target them, because ultimately it's going to help the people that live there, and it's going to help drive the crime rate down and everything else. We know what makes a difference.
Now, one closing question before we are ushered out of here. You're running for re-election in 2015.
Absolutely.
You announced it. Do you expect it to be contested this time?
Well, I would hope that it wouldn't be contested.
Because it wasn't in 2011.
It wasn't in 2011. But I would think that, with some of the things that are going on, I would think that Francis Slay would put somebody up. I would think that he did. These things are like a boxing match. You're in the ring. You swing. You expect to get hit back. And if you don't expect to get swung back at, you shouldn't. It is what it is. Yeah. So I would not. I would not begrudge him for doing that. That's probably what he is going to do, and it would be appropriate.
Well, we have to get through the license collector battle first, and then we'll get to your race. But, Mr. President, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure and an honor for you to be here.
Right, thank you.
For more of our stories, you can go to stlbeacon.org or stlpublicradio.org. You can follow me on Twitter at Jay Rosenbaum. You can follow Rachel at
R. Lipman, 2 P's, 2 N's.
You can follow Joe at
Jay Mannies. It's JMANNIES.
And you can follow the very tech-savvy President Reed at
Pres Reed.
Now, thank you very much for joining us today, and until next time, so long.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.